And I just had the idea of trying to actually report on every team. I said, let me try to name every team in this post. That's not something that I've really seen done before. I'm not going to say it's never been done before, but I haven't seen that. Coverage tends to focus on the top teams. And then when it's not a top team, it's usually because some crazy story has happened to some mid-packer or some team at the back.
Welcome to the Dark Zone, an event racing podcast. This is your host, Brian Gatens. In event racing lingo, a dark zone is a time when, due to darkness or safety, teams are paused on the course before continuing with the race. During that time, stories are exchanged, friendships are kindled, spirits are restored, and teams have a chance to prepare for the next challenge. We hope that you make good use of this dark zone. We're glad that you're here. Today we're joined by Brent Freedland. Brent and his wife Abby are the co-founders of Rootstock Racing. And recently, Brent stepped out of his comfort zone and acted as an online Dotwatcher for Expedition Oregon, Jason and Chelsea's epic race out west. On today's episode, Brent talks about how he Dotwatches, what he learned from the race, and what we could all take away from a race such as Expedition Oregon. He pokes into the scoring system, how teams hold it together out there with their sleep and their food, and he brings a lot to today's episode. So thank you, Brent, for being here. And best of luck as you and Abby tip the domino on the endless mountains in the next few weeks. Today's episode is sponsored by Strong Machine Adventure Racing. Based out of Maine on the northeast of America, Strong Machine brings premier events to everyone out there who wants to travel to that beautiful state. You can visit their website at strongmachinear.com. That's right, Strong Machine, one word, ar.com. Thank you for being a sponsor of the Dark Zone. And thank you everybody for joining us today. Sit back and relax. Brent brings us a good one. All right, listeners, today we are joined by Brent Freedland of Rootstock Racing. For those of you who know Brent is a prolific adventure racer, adventure race writer. He thinks about the sport. He loves the sport. Along with his wife, Abby Purkis, Rootstock Racing is putting on the Endless Mountains 5-day adventure race to be held this June in Western Pennsylvania. One of the three North American adventure race series, Expedition Canada, which is right around the corner. We just had Expedition Oregon, and Endless Mountains is coming in June. So, Brent, thanks for coming on the Dark Zone. We're invited you on today to talk all things adventure racing, but to really talk a bit about your recent experience acting as one of the primary dot watchers for Expedition Oregon. Dot watching is growing because the technology is getting so strong that we're able to sit home and watch almost real-time updates of our friends and our loved ones and our comrades who are racing on the course. Talk a bit about your experience with the dot watching for Expedition Oregon.
All right, Brian, thank you for having me on. And this was a pretty cool experience. Jason Magnus and Chelsea Magnus invited me and, as you mentioned, Barbara and Andrea Anderson as well to chime in with our view from afar. So they had all these great people on the ground reporting on the event firsthand. And we were asked to kind of share our insights. And I think all three of us come from different backgrounds in the sports. We're all kind of operating at different levels of experience. And so I think we all offered something unique when we were watching those dots. It was a lot of fun.
So here you are now. You're sitting in front of a computer. You have the live tracking that's up. Live tracking, as I said before, is working really well technology-wise. What strategies did you use to stay on top of the race itself when it came to being able to know how the race was going for all the races, but also for your need to report on the race to the public? What did you do from your vantage point to do a good job of that? It's more than just watching the dots, right? Because watching the dots crawl across the screen is not really the most effective way to really understand the race from a distance. If somebody's home and they want to follow the race, how do they go about doing it? What did you do?
Yeah. So I think one thing that was important for me that I wouldn't say this is something I did, but, I know a lot of the people that were in the race and I know a lot of the teams. And so when I'm watching dots compared probably to the average viewer, I actually can kind of imagine what's going on for some of the teams at the front. A lot of the teams that are kind of chasing those elite teams at the front, and also a lot of the other racers in the mid pack and those that are just there to try to finish the thing. Through our race directing and our travels for racing, we've gotten to know a lot of the teams. So, I think that was an important part for me as a dot watcher. Agreeing to help Ben cover the race really forced me to pay more attention to everything else that was going on. I think the big thing I did, I think the number one thing, maybe like the only real thing I did that I think was maybe a little bit different was, I think on day 2, I was starting to write up some kind of overview of what I was seeing. And I just had the idea of trying to actually report on every team. I said, let me try to name every team in this post. That's not something that I've really seen done before. I'm not going to say it's never been done before, but I haven't seen that. Coverage tends to focus on the top teams. And then when it's not a top team, it's usually because some crazy story has happened to some mid-packer or some team at the back. Often something negative, right? Some kind of issue or injury or something like that. So I felt really strongly that I wanted to try to cover everybody. And I put that post up, and it was honestly something I just did on a whim. And after that, I really tried to do that, not every single post, but, more often than not, I tried to make sure I covered the field top to bottom.
The race director publishes something called a schematic. Can you tell the public what is a race schematic?
Yeah, so in even in some smaller races, but certainly in expedition races, usually a week or two before the event, the race director will publish a 1-page document that has basically a visual schematic of the course. It'll tell you kind of usually the order of the legs. It'll tell you the length of the legs, usually a time estimate or a time range, ranging from the fastest estimate that they foresee to, maybe what it would take a slower team to do it, knowing that the slower teams are going to have to shorten the route along the way. And then there's usually some additional details, transition area, amenities, and things like that. So you get all that ahead of time. It gives the racers something to analyze and help them, better pack and prepare. And, if you're gearing up to dot watch, it's also something that can be a useful resource.
For those who want to pay attention to a race, it's good to pick up on the schematic because you can begin to connect all the dots of the race. How much digging into the terrain and topography do you do away from the maps? Do you look at Wikipedia articles about the area? Do you look at other races that were held there? What do you do with that?
I will look at the one thing I really try to sometimes look at is maps, especially USGS topo maps. One of the hard things is sometimes what the racers have. In this case, at least for big chunks of the race, I wasn't totally sure what their maps look like. So that makes it a little more challenging to really project what's going on with the team when you don't know what they're actually working with. So it's easy sometimes for us to be like, why aren't they going over there? And then you find out on the map that, well, it said there was a trail here that you didn't know about, or didn't show you a road that you can see on a satellite image, but they have no idea is there.
And I think to that point, and adventure racers for the most part are also map junkies, right? We enjoy looking at maps and poring over them. I would recommend to any race directors out there that after the race starts, obviously, if they're able to publish the actual maps that the racers are holding, makes that a much more interesting experience, because you could take the actual map that you had that you could print out a copy of, and then you can look at the tracker. And some races have the tracker map be the racer map. Sometimes that works out there, and off they go. What did you do during the race when there were huge gaps of time in which the trackers weren't moving because teams were probably out of range or something was going on? Did you look at other parts of the race? Did you walk away from the computer? Like, how did you manage that?
Yeah, I honestly, I'll be honest, I tended to take advantage of those moments to walk away, or, if teams were on a section, for example, that stage 3 paddle where tracking wasn't all that great for a lot of teams in there. But there also wasn't a whole lot to see. There weren't really navigation decisions or anything like that. So there was this long block of time where there just wasn't a whole lot of action. And while there was obviously a lot more going on that water section than there is in a lot of races, Typically with paddling, there's not a whole lot of race movement. Paddling is not the stage where you tend to see teams making up a lot of time, or even losing a lot of time. The difference of I guess difference of speed between top teams and mid-pack teams isn't as great as it might be on a bike ride. So I think I kind of tend to just use that as an opportunity to take care of life. Yeah,
that's a good point. Away from the dot watching, the fact that water appears to be a bit of a great equalizer. The fact that that's a place where if you're racing, that's not where you make your big move, right? That's where you sort of hold on.
It tends not to be. I mean, there are of course exceptions, right? If we're talking about a flat water lake, there's not a whole lot that's going to change. But, in an expedition race where you might have a 60-mile paddle, right? That's a lot of distance. So even if there's not a big difference in speed between, say, a top team and a back of the pack team, it will add up, right? If it's a really big stage. I mean, of course, in this race, we know, those of us that watched it, that whitewater section early in the race really, it really changed some things for a couple of teams, right? So when you've got conditions, or even a skilled paddler, something can go wrong, right? Whether it's, the timing, you hit a whitewater section late in the day, right? You're tired, you're cold, you hit a sea kayak at night versus the daylight, things like that can change things quite a bit. But overall, absolutely. I wanted to say one more thing kind of based off what you were saying earlier. I think dot watching, I mean, I can imagine some listeners are probably thinking, this is not as exciting as someone just talking about bend, right? Like I'm definitely not as exciting as the Peak Pursuit team that you had on the other day. But I would make a plug for people to look at dot watching as a learning experience, right? People that actually are racers and especially people that are less experienced. I think dot watching can actually be a really educational experience. You, of course, don't have all the information, so you can also make bad judgments, but there's a lot to learn from watching teams race.
Looking back in Expedition Oregon and really kind of embedding yourself into that race and really being so deeply involved in it, what did you take away from it from an experience perspective? What did Expedition Oregon teach you? Because a lot was thrown at the racers. You had weather, you had big water, you had a long route, very hard. In your conversations about the race, either with Abby at home or with your friends about it, what do you think some of your takeaways were from the race in terms of learning?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't think I'm going to actually answer your question directly, but it gets me thinking about something else that I was just pondering a lot. And, I had a couple people reach out to me actually about our own expedition race, which we're directing next month, the Endless Mountains, kind of asking like a bit wide-eyed, right? Is this what it's like? And, I think watching Expedition Oregon unfold, it reminded me a lot of 2015 when we raced in Alaska, and I think every once in a while you get a race like this that is, that's really much more technical than your average race. It was a hard race no matter what. And it was obviously made much harder by, the snowfall they had in the week before the event and the conditions during much of the race with additional snow and cold temperatures. That's obviously not necessarily what the race director was looking for when they directed the race or designed the race. But there's a place in our sport for that kind of event. I think there are people that really want that kind of event. And it's an event that I think will live in, the legends of adventure racing. People will be talking about that race for a long time. And, I think some people are still pretty shell shocked, I think, from the experience, mostly in good ways. But I think down the road, it's going to be one that people are really proud to have participated in. That said, I do think for newer people to the community, I think it's important to realize that, as is true of all races, they all have different flavors. And Oregon is a very particular type of race. And it's not really, I think, representative of what a lot of expedition races are like. So for people that want that technical challenge, that kind of want more of that, you're kind of on your own out there in the wilderness, it's a great event, right? I think for some other people, maybe it's a good one to watch, but maybe there's other ones that are a better starting place.
There's no doubt with when Jason and Chelsea called America's toughest race, they're putting the cards on the table, right?
Yeah.
And they're telling you what to expect when you get out there. And clearly a race such as Oregon, and I do agree, it's going to live in legend for a long time.
Yeah.
It is metaphorically and literally speaking, you're jumping into the deep end of adventure racing, right? There are big mountains, big weather, big challenges. We saw where Lars Bukahav, who is a well-regarded, winter guide himself, adventure racer. He had a case of hypothermia that he's fined from. That took a lot of us by surprise because guys like Lars don't get hypothermia. We heard stories about racers getting detached from their teams. Peak Pursuit found a racer out on the course. So clearly you're going to get that. To your point, for those listening at home who are considering doing an expedition level race, this race is on a far end of the spectrum in terms of difficulty and challenge and how muscular it is. That won't necessarily be experienced in other 5-day adventure races that you see. But to Jason and Chelsea's credit, what you see is what you get. And it's going to be a hard race. So let me pivot then for a second to Endless Mountains. And obviously that's your race coming up in Expedition Canada right around the corner. If someone were to watch the Expedition Oregon, I was using the word telecast. We're not there quite yet, but the broadcast, if you will, of the show. What do you think they should take into Canada and Endless Mountains in terms of gear, preparation, food? What will serve those racers best in those big experiences?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think it's very difficult to compare one expedition race to another. I think it's a lot easier to compare kind of the sprints and even a 12-hour, even a 24-hour race. Those tend to be, relatively similar. The big difference tends to be weather, right? The temperatures and is it raining? Is it not? Right. I can't speak too much about Canada. I would expect Canada is going to be like a big elevation race. I think there's going to be a lot of vert in that race. I think there'll be the potential for cold weather in that one as well. As I recall, I think there was cold weather in it last year when they last ran, but I might be wrong about that. I might be thinking about Primal Quest that was also up in British Columbia a few years ago.
I mean, it is still Canada. It is still, our friends to the north, right? You're going to get weather up there.
Yeah, for sure. And the water, right? So even if the weather is relatively pleasant, you're racing in a part of the world where the water is cold. When we raced in Alaska, it was, I think, July. Can't quite remember. Maybe it was late June. And it was quite pleasant when you were out of the water, but we spent of 7 days, it wouldn't surprise me if we were basically in the water for 48 hours of it.
Right. And that's glacial water. That's cold, barely above freezing water.
Yeah. I've never been so cold, and I know I would have been colder if I was in Oregon this week, but Alaska definitely was a really tough race in terms of thermal control, and it barely rained. So I think water is always such an important factor that people don't think as much about. And it's not just what are you paddling in? It's, are you going to be crossing through the water, right? Are you going to be saturated? Are the woods dense? I know here in Pennsylvania, if it's wet out in the woods, it can be a sunny day, but you're going to get saturated quickly when you're bushwhacking. And if it's not particularly warm, you can get very cold really quickly once your clothes are saturated. So I think that's, one of the biggest things. Endless Mountains will be different. At least knock on wood, it should be different. June in Pennsylvania these days tends to be the opposite. It tends to be quite warm, so I think that you have a different challenge there with heat. I think that heat is going to be something that we all need to look out for at Endless Mountains. Personally, I don't know where I would err because actually, I personally do better in the cold than I do in hot weather. But when you're in the cold, sometimes there's absolutely no way to get warm. Whereas when you're in the heat, you can go find a creek and sit down. You can stop moving and, soak something in water and put it on your head. There's ways that you can manage that. You can take clothes off. It works. Right. So. Yeah.
I think the thing to keep in mind is, and I don't know the temperature swings they had in Oregon. It was cold. It felt like it was cold all the time when you watched that race.
Yeah.
And to your point, I don't know about Canada, but I do know, knowing the Northeast, knowing Pennsylvania, most likely the races will contend with temperature swings. They might it might be down at night, it might be down into the 40s.
Yes.
And during the day, it could be up in the 80s. And so it's the idea that you have to have, thermal control is the word of the day. You have to be able to put clothes on and take them off as necessary.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. And you just don't know. Today, it's, an absolutely beautiful low 70 day here in Southeast Pennsylvania. Tomorrow, it's going to be over 90 degrees. And I suspect quite unpleasant. It can get quite humid when it's that hot. Now, I will say, the Endless Mountains, it's not British Columbia. It's not the Cascades. We don't have 5,000 foot mountains, but it is still a mountain environment. And, I've been out in the Endless Mountains region in June, and I've seen everything from, dry heat to hail and freezing rain. So it is still definitely possible, like you said, to see those swings, especially between day and night. So yeah, I think you need to be really kind of dialing in your clothes, right? And be prepared. I think another thing that is worth highlighting, which I know our team, hearing some of the reports behind the scenes the last couple of days, something our team actually struggled with was sleeping.
I've heard that was the coming out of the race, the how little sleep people had really was something else, and they still able to function.
Yeah, it was. And, that was partly, again, like the conditions just created a course where it made it very hard to sleep. That's not the racer's fault. But, do you have the right gear? I know there were some teams that, didn't have kind of sleeping systems that really allowed them to comfortably sleep out on the course. And that kind of forced them to sleep in transition areas, which are a bit hit or miss. Some people have good luck with transition areas, but for a lot of people, they're noisy and there's a lot of activity, and it can be tough to sleep in those places. So, I think making sure that you really have, again, the thermal clothes system down, but then also a really good plan for sleeping. I think that back to one of your earlier questions, like, what do you learn? Again, it's not something necessarily that I would say I learned watching, but I think it's something that was really apparent and worth highlighting for people that are not as experienced. I think Oregon was a great display of the importance of sleep and the importance of good quality, intentional sleep. And I think Eastwind really modeled that. And normally that's something that our team does as well. They just had a hard time executing it in this race. But it's so important. And you can really kind of see how Eastwind benefited from that extra rest. Like, when they were out of TA and they were moving and they were moving well from start to finish of that race. Whereas most of the other teams, you could see them really struggling once they got tired. The pace fell off, they made more mistakes. It's a fine line. I definitely was wondering toward the end of the race, man, if Eastwind cut 1 hour out of one of their sleeps, might they have been there with Vitorade at the end and really had a sprint to the end? Possibly. So you can sleep a little too much, but if they hadn't slept as much, they might have been 10 hours behind Vitorade as well.
And that's the magic formula, right? And it's different for every race. And what are you going to do? I know what I've seen over time, and the sample size is small. I have seen a few teams that, by virtue of racer challenge in the beginning, or they were caught in a dark zone, that they took more sleep at the beginning of the race, and they appear to be more present at the end of the race. That you see from time to time, there are teams that just skip sleep because they want to get into a bigger lead, or they want to bite into someone's lead. And all of a sudden, the last 36 hours, they just disintegrate, they come apart. And I think we saw that in Oregon. There were some teams at the very end that had just forgotten how to read their maps. And it had to be exhaustion coming in. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we've all been there, right? I mean, we've definitely all been there, but, we have, a series of articles on our Endless Mountains blog. And one of those articles is specifically about sleep, right? And really kind of goes over different approaches to sleep. And so, for those newer racers that are looking to learn more, watch the dots, but, check out an article like that, talk to more experienced racers about what they do, what gear they use to sleep. It's a really crucial part.
What was your take on the various strategies regarding food that racers had used? I know the dots don't allow themselves to understand what they're eating and how they're eating, but what did you hear either in conversation or from other sources? How did teams do with food over the course of the race? Was it a mix of real food? Was it a mix of goos and gels? I mean, it's a long time to eat. It's a week's worth of eating you have to account for.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't think I heard a thing about food. And you often do. You often, get an insight into what some teams are eating, but I can't imagine it was really any different than normal. I think that most experienced teams know that for a multi-day race, you really need to get real food into your food plan. If you're just relying on, gels and bars, which you can kind of get through with a 24-hour race, races up to that point, you can't do that in an expedition race. Your stomach's going to revolt on you. You're going to get to a point where you can't really look at that kind of food. You need something more substantial. So I've got to think that teams were kind of balancing that diet. But, I also kind of wonder, because normally in an expedition race, it's not uncommon to pass through towns and see stores, and often multiple times. I know some races, even some of the top racers have brought very little food with them because there's so much on the course that they just go light and just buy stuff as they go. I don't get the sense that they saw much of anything.
I feel like, when they came back through the lodge, right, after they did that first lollipop section, they paddled across, they had a fire, they had food there. And as you and I spoke about during the race, God bless the teams that after that crushing first 2.5 days, got back to the lodge and realized in front of a warm fire with a meal that they had to go back out there and the race, and they were only like 45% of the way through the race. So kudos to, anybody who experienced, raced, survived Expedition Oregon should be proud of that accomplishment. And the growth and the learning has been incredible coming out of that race.
Absolutely.
I know you have your fatherly duties lying in wait for you on the other side of that door behind you. Before we move on and before we finish off the podcast, any of the thoughts that you had, big high level things that you took out of your dot watching of Expedition Oregon?
I was really intrigued by their scoring system. It was a bit of a unique system. So, traditionally in really any adventure race, but in most adventure races, especially expedition races, it's a point-to-point course. Traditionally, old school racing, you had to get everything. And if you didn't, you were unofficial.
Right. So the minute you missed one checkpoint, your race was over.
That's right. Now the sport has progressed quite a bit since those days. There is still a vocal minority that likes to, complain that they wish that that's what it was. But, I think a lot of race directors have figured out that if you only have 20% of your teams actually finishing the race, that's not always a great look. It doesn't necessarily.
And it gets complex because there's full course finishers, there's short course finishers, it's a weird scoring system, right? And so Ben tried to fix that.
Yeah, so they had an interesting system of, really assigning everything points, right, and making transition areas the highest value. So each transition area was worth 100 points, and then they had kind of, I would think about it maybe as like a short course route. It was kind of maybe the more or less the most direct way you could go through the course, and those points were worth 25, and then there were additional points off of that route, which added more navigational challenge and a little more distance. And those were worth 10 or 5. Some of them were worth 5. And it was a really interesting, I think, approach to it. I know there's already some interesting discussions online about the merits of that system. And I think there are some valid kind of questions about whether that's the best way to score a race. And I know that Jason has commented publicly that there are things that he would like to tweak about it. But, I can say that Abby and I are really intrigued by it and are intending to adopt at least part, maybe not 100% the exact same system, but at least part of that system for Endless Mountains. We're hoping to work with our colleagues in the North American Expedition Series to help kind of standardize things a little bit in those kinds of ways. And
I think that as I would describe the scoring system to people who aren't familiar with it, I would say that what the race director does is that he or she chooses points along the course and assigns various point values to those checkpoints. Transition areas, orienteering legs, whatever it might be, pro points versus regular points. And then teams make the decision, the points that they punch, they accumulate those points over the course of the race. And at the end of the race, they turn in their punch card and they have a potpourri of various points that they got, add those numbers up, and points beat time. And I think that's really what it is. And what it does, and I think it's And I saw this in Scotland, and I think Itera and James Thurlow did it somewhat informally, because they want to keep you on the course and they want you to have a good experience. That they basically said, if we bring you forward on the course, you're still a racer. You have to finish by a certain time, but you're still a formal racer. I think that's formalizing that system and giving a lot of flexibility to racers to make decisions. Because to your point, in some races you would miss. There's 25 or 30 checkpoints in a race. You'd miss the fifth checkpoint, and all of a sudden you're either unofficial or you're a short course team, which is a little demoralizing when you look at a race in the face.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's all right. I think the one kind of big question that I think we've talked about is, and I've talked to a few other folks about it, and I think some of the discussion I've seen, I think on our discussion group, was about this issue, is basically the question of, if someone gets in a vehicle, right? Mm-hmm. Can they potentially manipulate that? Maybe not even intentionally, right? Like, I mean, I will be honest. I think that they may get mad at me for saying it. I think our team got a little bit lucky at Oregon this week, in that it was not an intentional strategy for them to end up basically bypassing the stage 4 bike. And in fact, they had no intention of getting in a vehicle, but they did end up being asked to get in a vehicle, and they were driven to TA4. And I know that helped them, right? Being able to bypass that stage 4, even though that was their intention anyway, that was definitely a game-changing thing compared to all those teams that went up into those snowy mountains with their bikes for 20 hours.
Right.
And I think that's like the big tough question is, if I put a team in a car and I shuttle them forward for one section, is it equitable if I put a different team in the car on a different section?
Right.
I dock them both 100 points, but maybe those 100 points are not in fact equal.
Right.
So I think that's the big question. I know some people feel like, hey, you can score it that way, but if you get in a car, you should be ranked behind everybody else. And you could still be official, right? So I don't know. I think that's the $1 million question on that one.
Yeah, because we had that in Scotland. A whole bunch of teams were put in a car and brought forward on the race. And they basically said, we can't put you into this mountain range because you're never going to make the cutoff. You have a choice. Either get in the car and stay inside the cutoff, or don't get in the car and your race is over. And so to your point, but I respect the fact, and credit to Jason and Chelsea, that they're thinking about teams, keeping teams on courses, keeping points there. In many ways, we're building a better mousetrap, right? There's never going to be a final solution.
Yeah, that's right.
But they deserve credit for doing that. And I think Expedition Oregon, and I think Ben Racing should get a lot of credit for the race and in a variety of areas. Andrea, Barbara, their team offering the commentary, Dave Gedney with the videos that were coming out, the updates that were frequent, the quality of the tracking. I think they created a very, very strong immersive experience for the person at home who wanted to follow along. And, it wasn't, we remember day before there were trackers, people would leave, go race, and we'd hear about the results 5 days later, right? This is where we're really getting a sense of what's happening out there. So, and I think that they're on the cutting edge of what that's going to look like. And I think that the Endless Mountains of the world are going to follow along with that. I think that's kind of what they're doing and bringing it that way.
Yeah. And like I said, Canada, Bend, Rootstock, we're all talking to each other about trying to figure out ways that we can try to standardize things a little bit more than they are. I don't think you're going to see the events becoming the same. I think they're all going to have a unique flavor to them. Down to maps, right? Like everyone's going to do things a little differently, but there's also some things that we can at least, try to get on the same page with, if not the exact same line. So, and that's a great thing about adventure racing, is the fact that these are affiliated organizations that are given the ability to create races in their own spirit, in their own vein. So a Bend is a Bend, Canada is Canada, Endless Mountains, Itera is Itera, insert name of the race there. As long as there's some standardization that makes sense along the way, everybody gets to put their own spin on the sport, which is what's great about the sport, right? It's not the same thing every day. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Well, Brent, best of luck to you. Best of luck with Endless Mountains right around the corner. All the best to the family. Thanks for joining us on the Dark Zone.
Thank you, Brian. Great job as always. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the woods.
Thank you, Brent, for your analysis and thoughts around Dotwatching and Expedition Oregon. Best of luck to you and Abby as you tip the domino on the Endless Mountains Adventure Race, which is just around the corner. We look forward to having you return to tell us all about it. Special thanks to Strong Machine Adventure Racing. That's right, strongmachinear.com for coming on as today's episode sponsor. Be sure to check out their website and see their upcoming event, the Maine Summer Adventure Race. Special thank you to the listeners for choosing to spend your time with us. This podcast will always remain free to its listeners. If you've enjoyed this episode, please pay a visit to your podcast streaming platform of choice and leave us a review. Best way to spread the word. Also, always feel free to reach out to me, Brian, at ardarkzone.com. Your feedback and guest suggestions are always welcome. Thank you, listeners, for joining us at the Dark Zone, and have fun out there.